So we're looking at our object again, and we're going to begin adding shadows to it. Before we start doing that though, I'm really bothered by the form, and so now's a good time to actually clean up some of these lines and make sure the thing that we're painting looks like what we're looking at. And as I had mentioned immediately when we first began talking in this lesson, is that it's okay to layer the paint, and as far as like building up depth goes, it's just important that you're consistent in the coverage on top as you add one layer to the next. So that edge is getting a little bit better. And it's more consistently looking like the object, not doing quite as much of a lip there. So much of this process involves going back and forth between the two. As I had mentioned earlier, you want to make sure the object that you're looking at, you either have an image that you're referencing that is not changing, or the object isn't getting bumped, because there's nothing more frustrating than starting to capture it and then having it be moved on you. And you have to paint over what you think looked right, but it doesn't look right when you go back to it the second time, of course. So it's really important to have that image consistent, that object that you're looking at unchanging, which is where taking a photo can be one of the best tools that you can use. So I'm pretty happy with the actual form. As far as like the outline of that object goes, one thing that we'll talk a little bit about is the term stylization, which refers to your own unique style as an artist. And that's something that emerges almost immediately and will evolve as you spend more time in the studio, but it is pretty unchanging over time. It has a lot to do with a combination of the way that you look at things, the way that you manipulate the material that you're working with, and then also, of course, that hand-to-eye relationship and how your hand translates things that your eye sees. So, as far as that goes, even looking back at my earliest acrylic paintings, they aren't all that different from some of the work that I do now. So we're going to go ahead and talk about getting some of that darkness in there. Now, monochromatic work is best when you're first learning how to manipulate paint, because if you're trying to blend color and learn how to do transition from light to dark, and also trying to work with the dry time of acrylic paint, you'll find yourself pretty frustrated, because those are a lot of factors that are really difficult to control. And even after a decade of painting, I would say are things that still consistently challenge me as an artist. And that's has a lot to do with why I prefer oil paint over acrylic. But as you'll experiment with the open medium, what you'll find is that it'll extend that dry time and give you a little bit more time to play around with the look of the object. So right now I got that black paint going partway up, and then you notice I stopped and came back in with the red. And even in that short period of time, that black paint, you see, dried enough to create an edge. So the dry time that you have as far as like how long you actually can move the paint, I would say is anywhere from a minute or less. Usually it's about a 30-second window. And that's why with acrylic paint, you really don't want to cover large areas. You want to work in pretty small sections, because by the time you return to where you started moving the paint, what you'll find is that it'll have already dried on you, and that can be pretty frustrating to return to. So right now we're just layering paint between the black and the red, getting enough of both to where it's a good base, a good foundation. And as we were doing earlier, when I showed you how to do scale work, you're going to want to have two brushes going simultaneously, a dark brush and a light brush, and that'll give you control over blending. One thing that you're going to notice with your acrylic paint, that it's one of those you have to experience it firsthand before you really understand what I'm talking about, is how easily that paint can be lifted if it's not dried completely. And so what I mean by that is, if you're painting with water and the actual paint itself, and if that paint is not truly dry, and you go over it with a wet brush, some of the paint is going to lift up and you're going to get this patchy thing going on that means that you have inconsistencies in how thick the paint is applied, and then you have sections of canvas that are showing through. And in order to actually cover those all the way, you really do need to wait for it to dry completely. So right now, what I'm really trying to do is just create that gradation from light to dark. One thing that I'm fairly aware of, and that I'm going to keep an eye on with you as you're learning how to manipulate the paint, is how heavy your brush strokes are. Because I add a fair bit of water to my brush strokes to help the paint move. And one of the things that I've seen when folks are trying to learn the material but are not necessarily spending enough time learning about how fluid it is, or how fluid it should be, is they have a tendency to just cake on paint. So what happens is you end up having almost an impressionistic canvas where the layers of paint are so thick that you could run your finger across them and feel all the bumps. And that's a technique that it's okay if you work in that technique after you've learned how to blend the paint on your own. The blending process is important to learn because what it teaches you is how to actually pay attention to how thick or thin your paint is, how far up the brush it's getting. It also teaches you to pay attention to the control you have over your brush strokes. And all of those things, while you're learning, can be really frustrating, but in the long run, it'll serve you much better. So that interior of the mug is not perfect by any means, but it's close enough to where I'm almost ready to start moving to other parts of it to start dropping in shadow there. Some of the things I just want to smooth out are some of these edges on that lip at the top. We're definitely, you wouldn't call this blocking in as much as segmented blending, so I'm blending in certain segments, and I'm still putting in like chunks of color, but I'm trying to help that transition along. I'm not just painting a black stripe and letting it be this solid black shape. I'm actually trying to blend it with the red so that it's a transition from light to dark. So you're actively working on that paint while it's still wet. Alright, so that interior is pretty good. I think I could work with that. You want to have a variety of brushes, and so you saw those other ones were pretty thick. Now as I'm looking at like some of these other places like the rim underneath, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush so that I have more control, because there's really not a huge area that we're painting. If you don't switch brushes and you stick with the same size brush, you're really just going to make things more frustrating for yourself. One thing you want to keep in mind as you do this is, again, how quickly that paint dries. And although we can add more layers of paint, it's helpful if you blend as you go. So I've got that red brush that I just brought a little bit of red in, and then I've got this other little guy that I'm working with, the black, trying to pull that down. And it looks pretty dark on camera, but keep in mind that we still need to add the highlights to this. And right now we're working from dark to light. So we're just getting that rim covered with a bit of dark. And when you see my brush disappear off camera, just to let you know, because I know you can't see what I'm doing back here, is I am alternately grabbing a little bit of paint and a little bit of water to help things stay fluid and to help them move along. And then you see I'm using this other brush, which I'm keeping it fairly wet with water, but mostly it's just got paint on it so that I can actually help that red to transition. So I'm going to get an even larger brush than what I was working with, and I'm going to take some red paint and take that onto the edge of this brush while this paint is still wet enough to move it a little bit. Okay? So that just blends out a little bit. So I've got that place darkened up, and now I'm going to just continue blocking in some of this dark. And what I want you to notice is I'm actually working with a dark gray right now. So if I were working with pure black, it would be even darker than what it looks like right now. But that dark gray is already fairly dark. And then I'm making sure to add enough water so that my paint is fairly fluid and moving pretty easily for me. So now we're going to take a look at this handle, and once again, if you're wanting to reference the actual image, make sure to look at the photo that I provided that you can download so that you can see what I'm seeing, and don't be afraid to pause the camera to actually look at the image more closely for yourself. So I've got that tiny bit of black there, and what I'm looking at is how the rim of the cup is creating a shadow on the top of that handle. And then, as with the main body of the cup, I'm using that red paint to blend it out. Okay? And then we're going to go ahead and keep moving. And then we're going to head down to the inside of this handle here. I'm going to get a little bit of water to help that paint move because it's trying to dry out on me, which I don't like. And And I'm going to get in here with my red to smooth that just a little bit. And that starts to create the bend that you see in the mug. I just want to make sure this black goes all the way up into the edge of it. And comes and tapers off right there, real small. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and let's see. Alright, now I'm noticing the edge of the mug and where it actually rests on the surface. And same thing as before, I'm going to put a tiny little bit of black right here where that shadow takes place. Make sure your paint's fluid because your brush will dry out. I like to think of the consistency needs to be sort of like watercolor paint where you actually have something of a puddle that you're pulling from. That's a really sharp edge right there. And so I'm going to show you how to make that soften a little bit. I'm going to get another brush that has white on it. And I am just sticking the tiniest edge of this brush onto the edge of that black paint. And this brush is quite wet with paint and also with water. And I'm just dragging that across that surface there. If that helps you can see that I'm doing a little bit better. And because the brush is nice and wet and it has that paint on the edge, what it's doing is the bristles and the edge of the paint are doing the blending for me. So it's creating a little bit of the illusion of that shadow. And then I'll go back in with my black just to make sure it's a nice clean line. So for the first, so essentially, just to like recap a little bit before we move on, essentially what we've got down right now is actually 2 layers of paint. We have the first layer where we blocked in the shape itself, and then we have the dark that we've started to add in so that you can actually see where the shadows take place. Before we start adding highlights, we want to actually get some of those mid-tones of the red going on. And so what we're looking at right now is where there are places along the mug that they aren't pure red and they're not black, they're somewhere in between. And so if you think back to the scale studies that you had to do, where you were practicing tint, tone, and shade, in this case I'm mixing up that mid-tone, and then I'm going to start painting in some of this mid-tone color. So it's as it's part of the hue mixed with black, but there's a little bit of white in there too. So it's not completely translucent, which is what can sometimes happen if you're just working with black and the color itself. So this is similar to blocking in the sense that I'm just placing these sections of mid-range color, and then I'm softening the edges. And I'm using a fair bit of water to help me keep those edges soft. Now is a good time to add in that white cross before we get the red paint so thick that that the white covers it, and I depends on your personal style with exactness for detail. I'm okay with it being recognizable without being exact. Some artists would not like that. They might want to draw it out so that it looks exactly proportionate. But in my opinion, if you're freehanding most of the body of the mug itself, and then you have this exactly geometric shape, obviously the mug is an organic shape, mostly organic, I should say. There are some geometric lines to it. But if you have this object that's freehanded, and then you turn around and have an exact, perfectly measured out form, that form is going to feel like a sticker that you stuck on there. It's not going to actually look like it fits with the style of the overall style of the piece. So I'm getting the general form down, and it's okay with me if it's not absolutely perfect. One thing you'll notice that I want to draw your attention to is how often I move my brush and use different sides of the brush to paint. And depending on the amount of time you've spent painting, you'll be able to, that'll become more and more natural to you as far as manipulating the brush goes. I switch the brush fairly often from one side to the next, and that's because the paint can gather on one side or the other side. And so instead of just grabbing extra paint, I want to move the paint that's on the brush and get it off the brush onto the canvas. So I flip from front to back. And then the other thing I do is with a brush like this, where the bristles are actually pretty stiff and they're pretty new, you see there's not a lot of splay. There's still a pretty tight line. And so I'll use that line to help me outline things and to actually produce a nice smooth line to control the aesthetic of the object itself. So right now what I want to do is I'd really like to clean up the edges of this, but if I were to try to do that, because the white paint is still wet, what that's going to do is it's going to blend the red with the white, and it's going to produce this pink color. And the object itself, the object is not pink, it is a stark object. So we really want to wait for that to dry. And while we're waiting for that to dry, we can start to look at some of the other parts of the mug and create some of the highlights that are missing from it, and then start to do some of those mid-tones. So we'll just look at the other camera real quick so you can see the difference, and we'll talk about the highlights on the object.